Broadcasting live to the world. Now, it's Sheila Zielinski.
This is a very sinister Luciferian eugenics plan.
These spineless weasels preach what people want to hear. They replace repentance with dreams of the good life. Mindless minions. Dying daily, taking up your cross, suffering and sacrificing have been superseded with name it and claim it.
And as dark as I know it looks out there, the good news is that God is advancing his kingdom. And it's very exciting to be a part of his great commission.
It's Sheila Zielinski. The Sheila Zielinski Show, the only show to give you the truth behind the headlines, prophecy, and the deeper things of God. Now, here is your host, end-time watchwoman, Sheila Zielinski.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sheila Zielinski Show for this April 7th, 2016 edition. Thank you all for tuning in from around the globe today. I broadcast weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time right here on WINB and at weekendvigilante.com. And do not forget to sign up for my YouTube channel, as some of the shows go to YouTube before they even hit the podcast. And if you have not signed up for my podcast, do so by going to the Listen tab at weekendvigilante.com and do sign up for the podcast. And of course, the Weekend Vigilante app. That app is a great way for you, the listener, to tune into the programs and have quick access to my social media tabs, my YouTube channel. Everything is linked there. It is very user-friendly and it's very convenient, and it's got a lot of great features. So there's a couple little tweaks going to be done to the app in the months to come, and that is, of course, being able to multitask while you're listening to the show. You'll be able to access the other features while listening to the program, and a couple little other tweaks that are going to make it much more user-friendly as well. But it's a great app with great features, and I really do hope you enjoy it. And if you have the app and you're enjoying it, please do let me know. I always do value feedback from you, the listener. And I just want to remind people that if you have a guest request and if you have a prayer request, if there's something going on in your life right now and you need prayer, get a hold of me. The contact information is there at weekendvigilante.com as well. Well, one of my good friends is back on the air today. It's been a while. He has been such a good friend of the program. Him and I did a show years and years ago together, and it is just such a privilege, such an honor. He wrote the foreword to my book, Green Gospel. He is truly a good friend. He's been a mentor to me and such a wealth of information. I always used to say he is a walking encyclopedia. It is my pleasure to have him back on this show. Dr. Timothy Ball, the renowned climatologist, joins us now. Tim, welcome back to the show. It is a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you, and it was a pleasure to write the foreword to your book, which everybody should read.
Yeah, it really is frightening, Tim. This green gospel, this environmentalism religion is, of course, we see now it's ramping up in full speed, of course, with Agenda 2030. That's like Agenda 21 on steroids. It is really frightening what is culminating and coalescing around this diabolical green agenda, isn't it?
Well, it is, and of course, I think a lot of people are becoming aware that it is taken on the format of a religion, but it's a frightening format because, of course, it's a blind faith. And one of the things about Christianity is that it says, ask questions, ask what's going on, find out the truth. Environmentalism is the very opposite of that. They don't want you to ask questions. And in fact, one of the proofs of that, Sheila, right now, is that so Senator Whitehouse, I think is his name, but also now with the backing of Al Gore and several of the state attorney generals are bringing RICO charges, that is racketeering charges against people they have designated as climate change deniers. And so if you are a heretic, as with all blind faiths, they're going to crucify you. This is a measure of just how fanatical this blind faith has become.
Well, not only is it blind faith, but what's frightening about these RICO, and for folks that don't understand that, Loretta Lynch mob, as I call her, Tim, I have a nickname for her. The Attorney General, she actually came out and said recently that they're actually considering prosecuting climate deniers. Now, think about the absurdity. And then, of course, you have Naomi Oreskes, Harvard science instructor. She's already talked about that we have to crack down on these devilish climate deniers. I mean, here's the thing, Tim, as a scientist, you know this, science is never settled, but that has really been the mantra of the day, is the science is settled, the debate is over. What debate? There never was a debate.
It is. And of course, one of the things about debate or argument, which has become a word that means that you're contentious, whereas in fact an argument was a reasoned discussion in the old days, but that's how things have changed. But there are different forms of argument. One is an appeal to an authority, so you cite the Pope or the Queen or somebody to justify your position. But one of the more common ones that traditionally was reductio ad absurdum. Now, that's a Latin phrase that simply means reducing to the absurd. And the way it works is that if you can take an argument that's being presented in its current form and reduce it to the absurd, it was absurd in the first place. So this is what's happening with this whole claim. And one of the ways that has been done is that the Australian government did a very interesting thing in that they came out and cut huge amounts of funding to climate research, which of course was in fact not research, it was pure propaganda seeking to prove what they were saying was right. But what they said was, okay, you're telling us the science is settled, so you don't need to do any more research. And they cut the funding. And I thought that was a brilliant reductio ad absurdum, which underlines what's happening. But as you said, science is never settled. And by the way, the person who is so much the architect of all of this, these phrases and these absurdities, is Al Gore, because he was the one that put that concept into the public record. And I won't say that's the official record, but the public record, which of course is what the media wants it to be, or what Al Gore wants it to be, when he appeared before the U.S. Senate a few years ago. And it was interesting because I've appeared before the Congress and the Senate, and I know that when you go there, the rules of anybody that's appearing are very, very strict. You have to present what you're going to say ahead of time, by a certain time, so they can read it and play their political games with it. You are given a certain amount of time to present, and you have to answer questions directly, and so on. Very strict rules. Gore appears, and there were no rules. He didn't even have to present what he was going to say. He just walked in there, and of course, it's that kind of club of politicians that people are so angry about in the current U.S. election. But when Gore appeared, he was the one that said, the debate is over, the science is settled. Those were two consecutive sentences, which of course are absolutely wrong. And they were so wrong that even some of the mainstream media, who were normally slathering at the mouth at the words of these guys, said, hey, hang on a minute, Al, not true. It was interesting because it's that kind of extremism that even people that don't understand what's wrong with the science that they're doing realize that, no, that's illogical, and it's making people stop and say, hang on a minute. So that's where that all began. And of course, Al Gore, as I said earlier, appeared publicly with the state's attorney generals, that, not all of them, but those that want to bring the RICO charges against the climate deniers. So this is what's happening, and it's truly draconian, frightening, totalitarian, the complete antithesis of what the founding fathers wanted and what America is all about.
Well, and to take it a step further, it's funny because in that testimony to Congress about global warming, Al declared, of course, like you said, the science is settled. Actually, the science is unsettling, but that's another issue. The fact that CO2 heats the atmosphere, he said, is absolutely settled science. And he went on to say the fact that the amount of CO2 that humans have already emitted is causing warming at an unprecedented rate. That was settled, he said. And the longer we continue emitting CO2, the worse it's getting. Now, what he told lawmakers that carbon dioxide emissions from cars and power plants and buildings are heating the Earth's atmosphere at an unprecedented rate. And he said, of course, if left unchecked, global warming is going to lead to dramatic changes in the weather, the sea levels, other aspects. But here's the frightening part. He said, and this goes back to the moral issue. He said, this is not a partisan issue. This is a moral issue. And our children are going to be demanding this. Now, what's also frightening is when he was on the David Letterman show, of course, he reiterated his mantra, but he said, the planet has a fever. If your baby has a fever and you go to the doctor, if the doctor says you need to intervene here, you don't say, well, I read a science fiction novel that tells me it's not a problem. That's unbelievable that he can say that on national TV.
It is. It's what's frightening about today's world and the ignorance and how people can be exploited. But it's also, of course, shows the implicit faith that he has in modern medicine. Modern medicine's done a lot of good things. There's no question about that. But, in my research, I estimate that longer life and better health, 80% of it is explained by better food, better nutrition, and clean water. And only about 20% is due to modern medicine. And that is completely ignored in that kind of obsessive comment that Gore has made. And the interesting thing about it is that, as I said, there's no question that medicine has helped. The discovery, accidental, by the way, of penicillin, and you notice so many of these things are serendipitous, but these modern medicines things, and there's that old joke about the most unsure person in the world is a Christian Scientist with a pain in his appendix. But the slavish adaptation and acceptance of what medicine is made is tied up in Gore's statement. And of course, what's tied up in it also is he accepts without question the scientific reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And of course, he has to do that because they manipulated that he got a Nobel Prize for an inconvenient truth at the same time as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change got a Nobel Prize for their work in the climate change issue. So they're joint Nobel Prize winners, and they've made such a farce out of that whole thing. In fact, the year that Gore got his prize, there was a woman who had, what she had done during the war, saving people's lives in the concentration camps and so on. There was no contest in terms of morality and ethics and humanity between what Gore did and what this woman did. But it shows the complete collapse of any values or standards and the political manipulation of even things like the Nobel Peace Prize. And they give them to criminals. They give them to all sorts of people that are completely undeserving. Come on, where's your ethics and morality? I would turn it down if I was given it or offered it just on that basis alone. And then there are other people who have got it that have gone to jail, and they don't take the award away from them. But this is what Gore's comments are underlining and telling the people about how wrong and evil these people are. And I mean the word evil in every sense of the term, because if you go out and start telling people what they can do, how they should live, and you simply don't understand even the basics, then that is evil in every sense of the term. And that's what Gore is doing.
Yeah, Gore is something else, all right. I always say, forget global warming. The only hot air is Al Gore and his huckster friends. And speaking of hucksterism, Obama is really back at it again. Of course, you just saw in the news headlines, China and the United States, they say the world's two leading carbon polluters, said just on Thursday that they plan to formally join the Paris Climate Agreement. In a joint statement, they came out at a UN ceremony in April. They'll take respective domestic steps to approve it as early as possible this year. That's quite interesting, isn't it?
It's interesting, but of course it's more of the false politics of today. The Paris Climate Conference, they all sat there and wasted the taxpayers' money and produced huge amounts of carbon dioxide flying in their jets. And by the way, they're all heading off to Kenya in April to do more of the same.
Yeah.
6,000 people are going to fly in there to a third world country. It's shameful. But anyway, yeah, at the Paris Climate Conference, what happened there was that they all worked together. They pretend to be in opposite camps and disagreeing. And it's the same, and this is what people are angry about with the US politicians. They argue and fight and pretend to be opposite, but then they all clock out and go for a beer together, and it's all part of the club. Well, what happened in Paris was Obama wanted his legacy climate change issue approved, which involved the Green Climate Fund, where every country in the world was going to put money into a pot, and this was going to help the developing and poor people, what a farce that is, to deal with the impacts of climate change caused by these evil developed fossil fuel burning countries. And so they fought and argued, and finally they came out with a communique, oh yeah, we're all in accord. It was meaningless. It was absolutely meaningless because there's no enforcement mechanism. If one country says, we're not going to do anything, there's nothing that they can do about it. And of course, this has happened all the way through, like with the Kyoto Accord. Japan said, oh yes, we'll ratify the accord, but we're not going to implement it. It's like saying, yes, so I agree there should be a speed limit, but I'm not going to pay any attention to it. And this is what these people are doing. They're doing it at the national level as the anger that Trump is exploiting, it shows in the U.S. and is occurring on the international level because of the United Nations, which is the most unaccountable, corrupt. I mean, it's beyond corruption. I notice now that Kofi Annan's son has just been charged with corruption of millions of dollars of funding. And Kofi Annan, of course, was the former head of the UN before Ban Ki-moon. Well, Kofi Annan and his son, and Maurice Strong, who's the architect of the whole climate change deception, Maurice Strong and his son, the four of them, made millions off of the oil for food crisis in Iraq. Now, just to let your listeners know what that was all about, Saddam Hussein came forward, and here's a monster who was using chemical weapons to kill the Kurds and kill people that disagreed with him. And by the way, all those chemical weapons did exist, and they're all now in Syria being used by Assad against his people. But anyway, Saddam Hussein went to the UN and said, hey, our children are starving because of you're not buying our oil and your sanctions against us and so on. So the United Nations said, okay, we will allow Iraq and Saddam Hussein's government to sell a certain amount of oil on the world market. That money has to go through the UN and then to feed the children in Iraq. The money got siphoned off by Maurice Strong and by Kofi Annan into their own South Korean bank accounts. And in fact, there is a photograph of a South Korean banker holding a check in the order of $980,000, almost $1 million, made out to Maurice Strong. And that was this oil for food crisis money. That's how corrupt these people are, literally taking the food out of children's mouths and yet pretending to saving the planet and pretending to be righteous and good. It is evil beyond belief. But as I said, they get away with it because the mainstream media don't report it. They get away with it, as we've seen with this leak now about all of these offshore bank accounts in Panama. And it was very interesting because Rush Limbaugh pointed out that all of the people that have got money in those bank accounts are all the dictators and the communist leaders and the socialist leaders of the countries around the world.
Yeah.
So here they're pretending to be, we're for the poor people. We're not, we're opposed to capitalism. Yeah, but put money into my bank account. And by the way, it's understood that, remember Yeltsin, who was the guy that took over after Gorbachev left Russia? Well, Boris Yeltsin's daughter was actually running the show. And the reports are that they paid her $40 billion to keep her mouth shut about Putin and what was going on. And so you hear these stories and you wonder how long before all of the people of the world rise up against all of the world's leaders. Because it's not just a crisis in America. It's not just a crisis at the UN. It's a failure of leadership in every country in the world. And if you look at that as an example, the migrants that are coming out of Syria and the Middle East are mostly young men, a lot of them terrorists, and they're leaving because of failure in their countries. And they're coming into our countries to wreak havoc because of failure of leadership in our countries.
Well, that's a good segue, Tim, because a major player in this whole thing we're talking about also is Peter Sutherland. Of course, he's been the Director General of the World Trade Organization, Chairman of Goldman Sachs. He was the EU Commissioner, Chairman of BP. He's had a real history, of course, an elitist with the Trilateral Commission. But he wrote an article in late 2015, and he was talking about migration. He was talking about the fact that we have to embrace diversity. And he said sustainable development is contingent on a growing multicultural society. Claimed that was the only pathway to sustainable development. Then you've got hucksters like the Pope coming out saying that Muslim invasion of Europe should be embraced. I mean, the world has gone off the rails, and you have these devils out there. And you mentioned the United Nations. That is Satan Central as far as I'm concerned. But isn't that frightening of how they're completely embracing it under the guise of multiculturalism and diversity? Isn't that shrewd?
Oh, absolutely. And then, of course, that's the evil genius of these people. And as you know, the devil is a genius. There's no question about it. How they can take anything and exploit it and make profit off of it, turn it to their own power agenda. And that's something that people need to understand. Follow the money. That's only true amongst the middle class and the lower class, that they can be bought off. They'll sell their souls for $1. But once you get to the level of George Soros or Maurice Strong or any of these people, it's not the money anymore. It's the power. It's the control. And of course, the controlling other people's lives is actually, whether it's done politically or forcefully with a chain around their neck, it's slavery. And that's exactly what these people are doing. Communism is political slavery. And yet nobody talks about it in those terms. And that's what this guy is saying. And of course, the multicultural thing, it's a disaster everywhere it's tried. In Canada, Pierre Trudeau, our former prime minister, promoted multiculturalism. And it took a black woman in a powerful position and that was Michelle Jean, who became the Governor General of Canada. She was a Haitian woman who emigrated to Canada, became the Governor General of Canada, and she said publicly, multiculturalism is a disaster. But she could only say it because she was in those groups that these power brokers had identified as oppressed and minority groups that should be allowed to have special privileges and so on. And so that's why he's introducing the term of multiculturalism. The reality is, of course, as we saw with Merkel, Angela Merkel in Germany, the reason that she said, we'll take 800,000 immigrants of these immigrants a year, it wasn't because she had a heart for those people or had a Christian belief in helping your fellow Christian. It was because she had a serious crisis of workers and workers that would work cheaply and do the dirty jobs. And the reason for that, of course, is because in the developed countries, as the economy developed, what's called the demographic transition kicked in. That is, people started to live longer, their death rate started to decline, but then the birth rate started to decline. And now you've got these countries like Germany, where the birth rate is about 1.6 children per family, when you need 2.6 children per family simply to maintain the population size. That's not even for growth, that's just to maintain it. And here they are at 1.6, which means that the population of the white European, their population is dying, and so they've been offsetting this with migration. Now, Japan is proof of what's going on because Japan is not allowing migrants. Japan is one of the most racist nations on the planet. They won't even allow migrants into their country. And Japan has got the problem that they've got all of these social problems. They've got an aging population, but they haven't got the young people to do the work. Well, that's happening in Germany. It's happening in Italy. It's happening in many of the European countries. It's happening in the US. It's particularly happening in Russia. And of course, Putin's got the problem that the European portion of Russia, the white Russians, who are essentially west of the Ural Mountains, their birth rate is declining, their populations and numbers are declining, where in the Asian portion of Russia, that is over the Ural Mountains, the birth rate is soaring. And they live in fear of being outproduced by the Mongol hordes, which have been their traditional enemy. So when you start to look at what these people are saying and what they're doing, what appears like, oh yes, great humanity, multicultural, we want these people to come in, the reality is they're just looking for work slaves to keep maintaining their industry and wealth so that they can put it into offshore banks and keep everybody enslaved. It is really, really frightening what is going on a global scale. It doesn't matter whether it's capitalist, communist, socialist, they're all doing it. And one of the things that I just finished doing is a series of 9 TV interviews, 9 one-hour Skype TV interviews with Romanian TV. And the science guy there, he contacted me and said, I was looking at this climate thing and I wanted to write a book about it. And in my research, I came across your work. And he said, I suddenly realized that all I knew was what the Romanian government were telling me. And so he said, I want to do on my science program, I want to present to the Romanian people what their government are not telling them. And I said, this doesn't surprise me, because what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, all of those satellite, supposedly autonomous republics, such as Kazakhstan, and you can name them all, Latvia and so on, everybody assumed that communism disappeared. It didn't. The communist leaders simply said, I'm a Democrat, and continued in power. They continued to control. And those are the places, too, by the way, where you see it, the Ukrainian leaders, they're the ones with their money in those Panama bank accounts. The leaders of Kazakhstan, you've got that one of them, his son, just multi-billionaire. He had a wedding that cost $1 billion. It's incredible what's happening with these people who claim to be, oh yes, we're socialists, we care about the people. It's the greatest myth in history, and everywhere you look, this is happening. And as I said, I wish you could just say, well, it's only happening on one side, but it isn't. It's right across the board, regardless of politics, regardless of the democratic structure that you got and the myth of that. It is truly the devil has taken over everywhere.
Well, yeah, and at the same time, you mentioned that word control. It's all about control. The United Nations, as we know, is also demanding biometric national identification cards for every person on the planet. I mean, this would just cause Aldous Huxley to salivate here, because it's so frighteningly draconian. It's serfdom by stealth. And on the heels of all this draconian measure, you also have what's frightening to me in all of this is the geoengineering that's taking place, which is truly frightening.
Well, just to go back to your microchip comment, and I'll get to the geoengineering right after, but I compare the microchipped idea that it's put under your skin at birth, and therefore they can track you not only if you pass through sensors, you have no idea who's monitoring or who can detect that. It's like now where you can buy a wallet that protects you against a criminal who can simply walk by you and scan the data out of your wallet. I compare those microchips under the skin to the tattoo that the Nazis put on the arms of people in the concentration camps. Right? Because one of the things that the Nazis were obsessed with was regulation, keeping track of everything. I mean, one of the things that has actually ironically been beneficial to understanding what they did was the incredibly detailed records they kept. When you look at the German banks and all of the gold teeth, and they actually had a system where all the gold teeth that were taken out of the people in the gas chambers, they had an agency whose job was to collect it, melt it down into gold bars, and put it into Swiss bank accounts. And that's all recorded. Well, I see the chips under the arm, no different than that. It's exactly the same thing. It's all about control. And of course, the geoengineering thing, there's an interesting side to that people don't talk about very much. Only weird thinkers like me do. If you get rid of God, you have to be God. You have to play God. You think you can play God. And I jokingly have said many times, it's an impossible job. And I know that because I tried it at home, and I know how difficult it is. But once Darwin and science defeated religion, you removed the Christian explanation for humans being on the planet. And now what you see is the whole social and political secular world trying to be God and to replace God. They've done it in the universities in that a complete new faculty emerged after Darwin called the social sciences. The whole social sciences are simply what I call human navel gazing. What they're doing is trying to show how humans are different than all the other primates and all the other animals. And they have to do that because you can't just say, well, no, we were put here by God. You're not allowed to say that anymore. They can't say that. Well, the same is true about controlling nature and controlling what you're saying. Well, humans are creating these problems, therefore we've got to correct them. And there's an arrogance in that is beyond belief. First of all, for example, in terms of the energy levels and energy inputs. I remember back when the ozone scare was going on, and all of the CFCs are destroying the ozone, creating holes in the Antarctic, and so on and so forth. And somebody said, look, we can produce ozone, we can manufacture it. And why don't we produce a whole bunch of ozone and pump it up into the upper atmosphere to replace the ozone that the CFCs are destroying? Yeah, you say, oh, that's a good idea. But you just sit down and do some back of the envelope number crunching, and you find out that to produce that much ozone would take every single watt of energy that humans produce in total around the whole world just to do it. So you suddenly start to understand the scales of energy that humans are involved with and can produce compared to with what God has given. I was doing a radio program the other day, and a fellow phoned in and said, look, can we offset volcanic eruptions by preventing them, by causing the volcano to spew out the lava, or by dropping bombs into them and all of this sort of stuff? And I said, look, all you need to know is that there is the equivalent of about 25 hydrogen bombs of energy in one thunderstorm.
Thunderstorm, yeah.
Right? And there are 10,000 thunderstorms operating at any given minute on the planet. So the idea that we could somehow produce the energies or control a volcanic eruption. It is absolutely the height of arrogance. But of course, it comes about when you believe you are God. They never talk about it in those terms, but that is precisely what's happening. And of course, the other problem is that if you don't know how the earth works, what the mechanisms are, and you start interfering with it, the chances are probably as high as 90% that you're going to create more problems than you're solving. All right. And that, of course, we've got many examples of that. I can give you one that I've studied quite extensively, and that is hailstorms causing damage on crops and properties and so on. And so a great amount of energy and time was put into hail suppression programs. And by the way, the Soviets were doing it, America was doing it, Canada was doing it in the Penhold, Alberta region, and spent millions of dollars on it. They've now abandoned it, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the idea was that hail is created in a thunderstorm because the raindrop is picked up in the updrafts inside the cloud, carried up above the freezing level, freezes into an ice pellet, which then falls back down because of its weight, gets coated with water, carried back up again, freezes. And if you take a hailstone and cut it in half, it's like an onion. It's layers, okay? And the idea was that if you could make the cloud rain, taking the water out of the cloud would then reduce its ability to produce hail. And so they started the cloud seeding, and that was one purpose of it. The other purpose of it was that for all of the clouds that form around the world, only about 1% ever produce rainfall or precipitation. So the idea was that if you could increase the chances of rain being formed within a cloud, you could then create rain. Now, primitive peoples have played God before Christianity came and made us understand better in their rain dances. The Inca, for example, they drew blood from their leaders and sacrificed people to make rain. But the cloud seeding idea, as I said, was to produce rain or to prevent hail forming. Now, there were two examples, one in the Dakotas, where they had a prolonged drought. Farmers got permission from the government to seed a cloud, that is, to add particles of dust to make more raindrops form and therefore to increase the rainfall. The rain occurred, but it caused a cloudburst. There was an absolute downpour. A reservoir got flooded, the dam burst, and people died. I believe it was 12 people died in the flooding. Of course, then there's lawsuits against the people that did the damage. And then similarly, in the state of Idaho, Washington State had forest fires, and they got permission to seed the clouds to cause rain to put out the forest fires. Idaho had a drought because they're downwind from Washington, said, hey, you stole our rain. And we're going to sue you for that. And this is the problem if you don't know what you're doing. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, is does cloud seeding work? We don't know, because you don't know how much rain would have come out of the cloud if you hadn't seeded it. So you've got no base point. So in every single case of geoengineering, humans thinking and scientists thinking that, and most of them, of course, as you know, are secular and atheists, thinking, oh, we can play God, we're greater than God, therefore we can geoengineer things, and it is a disaster. Now, there's another side to this, by the way, and that's the moral thing, and I used to talk to my students at great length about this. How could any scientist or human being sit in their laboratory and design and build weaponry that they know is going to indiscriminately kill women and children? How do you shut off the moral portion of your mind, of your human mind, to do that? Now, we've got a sort of a satirical answer to that, because Tom Lehrer, he wrote satirical songs. He was a mathematician who realized this problem of the morality of science. And he wrote a lot of satirical songs back in the 60s and 70s. And one of the ones he did was about Wernher von Braun, the German rocket scientist. And the song says, didn't you know, Mr. von Braun, that your rockets were indiscriminately killing women and children? And to which he has von Braun reply, I fired them up where they came down was somebody else's responsibility. And of course, that is the detachment that these people do. Oh, well, I just create the stuff. How it's used is somebody else's responsibility. Now, Einstein understood that problem because he said, hey, we've created the nuclear bomb, but it's up to our political leaders, our moral leaders, to use it wisely and peacefully. And he wrote a letter to the U.S. president saying, hey, here's your challenge. But of course, all of that gets pushed aside in the adoration of science and the glorification of science, and that scientists Obama does it. When he wanted to sell Obamacare, what did he do? He had all these actors put on white coats.
Yeah, Obamacare, because Obama cares so much about climate change, actually. That's a good segue, Tim, because there's a new immediate release on the whitehouse.gov site this week. It's a fact sheet on what climate change means for your health of your family. And stunningly, it lists this litany of adverse impacts on everything from the number of premature deaths to disease to illness. Because after all, the cumulative effects of climate change, they adversely affect people's mental health. It increases anxiety and depression. It even causes post-traumatic stress and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And as we know, people with mood disorders and mental health conditions, they're more vulnerable to extreme weather events in extreme heat. And of course, you know that because the planet is heating up with all this runaway global warming. So there you have it, folks. Climate change now causes suicide. What better reason to shut up those climate deniers like Sheila Zelinsky and Dr. Tim Ball? They're causing people now to kill themselves. You can't make this stuff up, Tim. So it's really another new twist in an old game here.
Well, it's a new twist, but it's of course what it's doing is if somebody is not listening to you, you're not getting their attention. You jack up what I call the emotional quotient. You raise the fear, and of course that's what they're doing. It's so immoral that you don't even know where to start talking about it. And of course, just to give you an example how wrong all of that is, one of the things that the White House has talked about and Obama goes on about, and part of that argument about health, is that with higher temperatures, there's going to be more deaths and more diseases and so on. But the truth is that more people die of the cold every year than of the heat. You can deal with heat in very relatively simple ways. I mean, if you want to talk technology, how about an air conditioner in every house? I mean, if you could put a TV in every house, you can certainly put an air conditioner in every house. And so the technological solutions to heat are much simpler. But if you got cold, boy, the amount of energy that's required to stay alive, all you got to do is watch that Survivor Man program with Les Stroud. The difference between him surviving in warm and tropical climates compared to trying to survive in the Arctic or on the tundra or even in the Canadian boreal forest. And you see the energy inputs. And we know from history, for example, back in the 17th and 18th century when we were in the middle of a little ice age, and the deaths that resulted. In 1688, we know from very good church records that 2/3 of the population of Finland starved to death and were frozen to death. So when you look at the famine and cold that comes from cold compared to the heat, it gives complete lie to all of these uses of climate as an argument. Of course, the other way that they're doing it is they're now saying, oh, the drought in California and the water issue, but that's all a fear and control. Every bit of it comes down to exploitation of fear to control people. And as you think you're losing that control, as they're losing the climate change argument, people are not paying attention anymore, then they simply raise the bar, and that's what the White House is doing with those statements. And by the way, to attribute deaths or diseases to global warming or climate change is virtually impossible. There are so many other factors that are involved, and of course they ignore all of those in their computer models and attribute it only to human causes.
Yep, human causes, those pesky humans and their infestation of Mother Earth. It's unbelievable. And you mentioned water there. It is amazing in the headlines. Again, you're seeing Nestle and other nefarious companies snatching up water rights left, right, and center. That's very frightening too, isn't it?
Well, of course, I taught a water resources class for 25 years because after teaching climate for a short period of time, I became aware that the single most devastating impact on flora and fauna, plants and animals and humans are droughts and floods, which is ironic because you've got the two extremes. But in the year 2000, they asked 200 climate people to list the 20 worst disasters of the 20th century. Numerical alliteration there, but of the 20 they listed, 11 of them were droughts. So, of course, what's happening is that as the climate issue is losing its power to control people, they're switching more and more to water as the issue. They've already coined the phrase and are using the phrase peak water. The United Nations are working on this, but it's all simply about control. Of course, what's interesting about water isn't just that it's essential to life on Earth. And notice, by the way, there's part of that arrogance again. We assume that because it's essential to life on Earth, therefore it's essential to life on all the other planets. I don't give God any credit for diversity or different ideas. And so what do? They go looking on other planets. The first thing they look for is water to say, oh, this is proof of life. Well, you don't necessarily need water to have life, but that's the arrogance of the scientific humanists. So the water is so critical in terms of a religious foundation and exploitation and control through fear. Now, in Christianity, of course, you see it. It's not used for fear or control. It's used for baptism. It's used to wash away your sins. It's used for cleansing, not for control. And that's a very interesting aspect of Christianity, which, by the way, differs from most other religions. When you look at the religious view of water and its importance, it illustrates a huge difference, how we view the world and what we know about science and so on. And of course, then when you view it from a scientific point of view and a business point of view, because you mentioned Nestle's, and one of the things that I can tell you in 1991, there was a conference in Milwaukee organized by the Oppenheimer Investment Company, and only people that had $1 billion to invest were invited to it. A good friend of mine, and I say that with pride because he was a former student and he's still a friend, and that's a challenge. He was managing $2 billion in funds, and he got invited. And who was sitting at the table but Nestle, Coca-Cola, Snapple, all of these corporations, and what went on after that? Dasani brand of water came out as bottled water in the Coke machine, and now it's got its own machine. And, of course, the control of water as a profitable item, and it was Coca-Cola and these companies that put out the falsehood that you need 8 liters of water a day. And now you see people walking around with a plastic bottle of water attached to their arm. And in one arm, they got that, and in the other arm, they got their cell phone. And they're all plugged into today's society, controlled by the corporations. And of course, what's ironic about it is these people that are pushing bottled water forget about what happens to all the plastic bottles necessary to circulate that water. But of course, one of the things that business does is because business, like science, is amoral and pretends to be apolitical. It's all about profit. Profit is a different issue. And of course, as you know, that's been a struggle within the Christian world. And what is a reasonable profit? What is the term usury? And so on. And I have no problem with business making profit. We can debate about what's a reasonable profit. The difficulty is that it drives these people to do amoral and apolitical things. We see this is the challenge against Trump. Say, well, you gave money to the Democrats and now you're saying a Republican. He said, that's the price of doing business. In other words, what he's saying is, I'll sell my soul for the profit. Do you want that as a leader? You see how all of these things interlink and intertwine, whether they're science or whether they're business or whether they're politics. They're all related around these moral and ethical issues. I think in a way, it's good that people are exploiting these things to the point where the ordinary person is getting angry and saying, no, I've had enough. I don't like what's going on. And this is the only way that the leadership will get challenged.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important point because we need to wake up as a whole. And that's really important. And that's what we try to do here is we really try to present information so that people will snap out of their slumber. And I think, like you said, some of these issues that are now coming to the forefront are really causing people to ask, what is going on? And like you said, how much more are people going to take? And the bottom line is people are they're fed up. These characters are ubiquitously running roughshod over the citizenry. And I just think there is a tipping point for sure. And that's really what we seek to do is wake people up. And you've been instrumental in doing that for decades. And I want to thank you for your time in not only coming on the program with such valuable information, Tim, but all of what you do. You wrote an incredible book, The Deliberate Corruption of Climate Science. Folks, if you have not got that is an incredible book. Tim, you've been such a mentor to me. You've been instrumental in the work that I do. And in your fight, you are just one of my favorite people, and I thank you. And Tim, in the waning moments, give out your website for the new listeners.
And my website is drtimball.com. That's DRTIMBALL. Dr. Timball, all abbreviated, no periods in it, just drtimball.com. And on there you'll find all of the contradiction, because the minute you put your head up, the liberals attack you. And instead of debating the issues, it becomes personal attacks. If you look on Wikipedia, you find all of the false information that's put out against me by the environmentalists, but I correct all of that about my qualifications and my involvement. But I also have a lot of discussion about the things that we've talked about here, about the morality and ethics and philosophy behind what's going on. Because I don't think that you can discuss anything without some sort of context. And that's what I try to do. And I know my answers are a bit long-winded, but I think it's essential. One of the ways that the media and people are exploiting us is the soundbite of taking something completely out of context, distorting the story. And that's why I so much appreciate what you're doing on this program and the valuable opportunity you provide me.
Well, it's my pleasure, Tim, because we are targets. Of course, when we are going to buck this mainstream system, we're automatically inundated with attacks on every side. So it certainly is a challenge in this time of controlled narratives. And who knows how much longer we'll have, but that's why it's so important in these last days to get this information out while we can. Tim, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on, and do come back and see us soon.
Oh, thank you, Sheila. And anytime that I can have the opportunity and to talk with you and your listeners and help them understand the world we live in and how people are trying to exploit knowledge of that for their own financial and political gain.
Thanks, Tim. Folks, that was the renowned climatologist, Dr. Timothy Ball. Again, his information is linked there in today's bio, drtimball.com. Do check out his handiwork and let him know you heard him on the program today. One of my favorites, as I said. For the new listeners, if you have not signed up for my free e-newsletter, please do so by going to the right-hand side of weekendvigilante.com. Make sure you get signed up for the monthly newsletter. I have a lot of updates and e-alerts that come out as well. And please do sign up for the YouTube, as I said at the beginning. Make sure you're signed up for the podcast, and you'll get notifications as soon as shows come out. And again, if you have not got the Weekend Vigilante app, do get it. It is a great customized app for you, the listener, and we're working on updating it with some really cool new features to be added, where you can also multitask when you're listening to the show. So you'll want to be looking for that. Again, as I said earlier in the program, if you have a prayer request, do get in touch with me. My contact information is on the contact tab at weekendvigilante.com. And just a reminder that Carla Butot and myself are working on a book called Power Prayers That Work. And I really believe that this is the time when we as Christians need to be praying more than ever. I always say our battle is on our knees in prayer. I thank you so much for tuning in to the broadcast today. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night and God bless.